So in today's video, we want to look at finding inverse functions. So what is an inverse function? An inverse function to a function f is another function which we denote by f to the negative 1, such that when you compose these functions, you get the identity function, which is x. This should also be f inverse composed with f. This is the more abstract interpretation of inverse functions. The purpose of today's video is to just look at how to find the formula for these inverse functions. To give a more intuitive explanation of what the inverse function is, let's consider the graph of something like the exponential function. Then we should expect that the inverse is given by the logarithm of x, and we notice that the logarithm is just the reflection of the exponential function across this axis y equals x. And so this is how we're going to find inverse functions. What we're going to do is we're going to swap x and y. That's exactly what's going on here, is we're swapping the x-axis with the y-axis, and conversely when we do this rotation. So you can imagine this rotation occurring here. And then we're just going to solve for y. So let's do a concrete example of this. So suppose we have the function f of x is 2x plus 3. So here we originally have that y is 2x plus 3. So step 1 is to swap x and y. So we have x is 2y plus 3. And then all we're going to do is solve for y. So we're going to have x minus 3 is equal to 2y, and therefore y is equal to 1/2 x minus 3. And so the inverse function, which we'll denote by f inverse of x, is 1/2 times x minus 3. Notice that f inverse is not 1 over f. 1 over f is the reciprocal function. F inverse is the inverse function. They're very different things. Okay, so let's do the same thing with a slightly more complicated example. So here we have y is equal to 3 plus 2 times the square root of x minus 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to write x is equal to 3 plus 2 times the square root of y minus 1. Then we'll subtract 3 from both sides. Then divide by 2. And then we'll square both sides. So I'm going to write that as 1/4 x minus 3 squared is y minus 1. And so what we have is that the inverse function is given by 1, that's coming from here, plus 1/4 x minus 3 squared. So the inverse of a square root function is a parabolic function, which makes sense. Okay, so let's try to invert a parabola. Here we have to be more careful because you can't separate the x's without first completing the square. So what we want to do is write x is equal to y squared minus 5y plus 6. And then we're going to complete the square. So x is equal to y minus 5 on 2 squared plus 6 minus 5 on 2 squared. So x is equal to y minus 5 on 2 squared. And then we're going to have, let's do this a bit separately. So we're going to have 24 over 4 minus 25 over 4. So this is just minus 1 over 4. So now we'll just add 1/4 to both sides. So we'll have x plus 1/4 is y minus 5/2 squared. And then we'll square root both sides. So we'll have x plus 1/4 square rooted is y minus 5 on 2. And so the inverse function here is given by 5 on 2 plus, I should have a plus or minus here. So plus or minus the square root of x plus 1 over 4. To determine which sign you take depends on the domain of this. That'll be the focus of the next video on inverse functions. For the moment, I just want to focus on finding the formula for the inverse. Okay, so if you like that video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing if you want to see more of the content like this. There'll be notes and practice problems with solutions in the video description. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below.